So my name is Catherine Stevens. I head up the International Trade Services team at Business West, and I will be joined today by Jane McKay, who's the owner and founder of Astute Ideas. We've been working in partnership with Jane for a number of months now, and Jane also works as a consultant for us, specifically in relation to the food and drink sector and specialising in the US market. So without further ado, if I can hand over to you, Jane, to introduce yourself and kick off the webinar.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Fiona and Catherine, and that intro, Catherine, that was lovely. So I just want to introduce myself. I'm Jane McKay, give you a bit of background. So I founded Astute Ideas, Astute Beverages being part of the umbrella company 3.5 years ago, with the intention of helping brands and businesses in food and beverage export and realise some opportunities in the US market. And I really cut my teeth in the US market over 10 years. So 10 years prior, I actually co-founded a spice manufacturing brand and business out of Chicago in Illinois. And we took it from farmer's market to Walmart and everything in between. So really, I love to help people with recognizing any opportunities and finding the pathway to the US for their export. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So it's a bit of a 101 for you. So without any more, I can't actually, there we go, take you back. We'll start the slideshow and I'll just take you through. And then Catherine's going to jump in as well, and she'll be my partner in the webinar, so she can answer any sort of trade specific questions that Business West deal with. So first of all, really, it's the who, the why, and the export ready. So the who, well, some of you are here in this room, obviously, your food and beverage brands that have been exclusively invited to participate today. The why, well, we can all consider exporting, but do we want to? So it's really sort of analysing some of our strategic reasons for looking at that as a new market. And then export readiness, we're sort of talking you through identifying some of those points at which we realise that as a business and a brand, we may be ready to start exporting. And I also have a nice case study for you. It's a Bristol-based brand that I helped over the last 3 years to launch and expand in the US market, and that's Caleño Drinks. And with their permission, I'm going to be able to share a bit of information. So without further ado, I'd like to jump into the who. So we've got sort of 3 headline points here: practical revenue guidelines, export readiness, and food and beverage specific considerations. So I think first of all, who, well, you probably all have a product or a beverage, a food or beverage product that you might think will sell well in the US. And so really these 3 key points up front are important when you're looking at this new lens of potential export. So from the practical revenue guidelines, really the main question that we like to ask brands and businesses is, do you have sufficient resources for a 12 to 18 month investment period? Because typically that's how long it takes to establish a successful market presence. And actually it can take longer than that. So I'll demonstrate some of that in the case study a bit later on, but it's the first question we really need to be asking ourselves at this point. And from my experience, I'd say that businesses with £1 million revenue or more than that really are probably in the right position to start considering export markets. It also relies on some other factors, such as, are you already exporting to other markets as well? But I would say anything below that, I am happy to consider discussing the potential. There are other routes to market for smaller businesses that aren't necessarily hitting that £1 million mark in revenue. So before that, we've really got some practical revenue points to consider. So there's fixed cost to compliance to get ready to actually take your product into market, FDA registration, labeling, all sorts of new things that maybe haven't been considered prior to exporting. There's also the marketing and distribution element. And so there needs to be really a brand building awareness exercise with any new launch. And so there will be some upfront fixed costs around that as well. The third point under the practical revenue guidelines is around working capital. So you need to have access to cash or some sort of cash flow investment capabilities, because you will require extended payment terms with certain new importers and things like that. So it's just knowing that you have enough cash to sustain that 12 to 18 month early on investment period. And also professional services. So there may be a requirement to invest in some additional support to consider exporting yourself. So that's the first point around practical revenue guidelines. The second one is export readiness. So it's really beyond the revenue considerations around profit margins. So typically having a healthy margin in your existing market or markets will help you absorb some of those costs of initially exporting. Production capacity is all about export readiness. Can you scale beyond your domestic demand or your domestic and other market demand that you currently have? And then cash flow, as I've already stated, really having those operating expenses to fund the operations for any export that you want to do. There are obviously exchange rate and tariff considerations that we wrap into this, and I know Catherine's going to touch on those a bit later. So there's some really sort of practical considerations around being export ready, locking in pricing really far ahead of time and understanding how that's going to work to your advantage. And the final piece on the who is around special food and beverage business considerations. So shelf life requirements are very different in different countries, and depending on how you're going to export and who's going to take your products, they will have different demands on what they require when your product lands in their warehouses. Some require 75%, for example, of shelf life when it actually arrives there. So that needs to be considered because you have shipping times to factor into all of this as well. So you need international shipping, obviously, requirements understood before you start sending stuff across the Atlantic. There's also specific FDA, so Food and Drug Administration, facility registration requirements and compliance and nutrition labelling that's different to our own in the UK and Europe. So potential reformulations as well are something that may need to be considered if products don't meet the expectations of the US Food and Safety Administration regulations as well. So these are all very specific to food and beverage, and there's obviously a lot more, but those are the key ones that I think we need to think about. So after these three sort of main points about the who, obviously there needs to really be a feasibility study and just to have a look at any pre-market questions that there may arise. So market analysis is something is around defining your target market and seeing actually who's ready to take your product. And if there's an interest in the product there, you can take that from census information, from industry reports, such as Euromonitor. There's all sorts of resources to do that. And looking at market size and trends and growth. The second piece around that really is customer validation, doing some qualitative research. Now, during COVID, actually, it became a lot easier to conduct international research projects without actually being in country. And there's some really good people out there that actually live in the UK but do a lot of back and forth, agencies who can help you do that on a very simple basis, just to establish some of the key demands that consumers in the US market may have. So it's really interesting using some listening tools as well around social media. So there's a lot more opportunity for doing that remotely, just when you're looking at validating your customer. And then regulatory and legal, as I said before, there's all of these agencies that you can use to verify some of these practical things up front when you're considering who should be exporting. Safety standards, labelling requirements and such. And then finally, the financial feasibility, looking at not only obviously your internal cash flow capabilities, but looking at the total addressable market in the market that you're looking at going to. What's the realistic market share and things like that. So looking at pricing and understanding if your product is actually going to be able to fit into that scenario. So that's really who should consider exporting. And as I said, it could be anybody in the room. It doesn't really stop, with any of those points, but it's just allowing yourself to think through a really strategic lens as to whether, who should be taking their product overseas. So I'm just going to go to the next slide. Here we go. I missed one. The why. So we're on to the very simple why. As I said earlier, we can all do it, but why should we do it, and addressing some of those strategic questions around that. And I think the biggest thing here is looking at the opportunity. There's such a huge opportunity in the US, and despite the current trade wins and everything else, I believe that opportunity still hugely exists. So if I give you a quick snapshot of the overall market and what it looks like. So in 2025, the US imported more than $170 billion worth of food and beverage products from overseas. And the UK to the US was actually about 2.7 billion of that. So we exported 2.7 billion pounds worth of products in last year, which predominantly is made up of Scotch whisky, salmon, cheese, but there's obviously room for a whole load of other interesting and diverse products as well. So we do have a huge market potential. And interestingly, since Brexit, it's increased last year 12%. Our exports to the US have increased 12%. So the opportunity is growing, despite any of the current sort of feelings we may have around uncertainty. The markets are there, and there's definitely opportunity for us all in the room. So looking at some of these reasons about, why you want to export, I think there are certain growth categories that are really, really hot right now, and I think will continue. One of them that I've worked in latterly has been the non-alcoholic beverage market, but it's really looking at trends in the market itself. So things that are resonating here and are also resonating in the US are those trends around digestive health and gut health. Nutrient-dense products to support the rise of the GLP-1 drugs and people taking those. So that a lot of like high protein, high fiber type products, those are really kind of doing some of the heavy lifting in terms of the market growth in some of these in the US certainly, and in the UK, but also any new flavors, fusion, anything like that. And obviously the staples that are tied to our heritage, things like the Scotch whisky and the salmon, they will never stop to be welcomed in the US market. So I think looking at some of those trends is really interesting to understand where they are in the US as well. And one of the things that I always like to say, and I should have said this up front, the US is 50 different states and it's like 50 different countries. And you may have heard that before, but essentially when you're looking at export and the strategic value, you may find your key market is one state. It could be that you want to export cider, and that's going to resonate not in Florida because they don't drink cider in Florida, but in Michigan or in Washington State, for example, which is where they grow the most apples and have the most cider. So it's actually looking at the US as 50 different countries in some regards, and a regional play for many products as well. So I'll just go to the top of this list about why to export now that we've sort of looked at the opportunity. It's kind of a why not in many cases, but again, it has to really sort of fit our strategy as a business as well. So revenue growth and diversifying risk. I mean, relying on one market is inherently risky unless you know that that's a solid market in perpetuity. And I'm not sure any of us can necessarily say that nowadays. But more businesses really hit saturation in their own domestic market very often. And so there's only so many customers we can reach in the UK, obviously. So opening up the US can really increase the potential. It can also, just as a word of warning, it's a very good diversion and can actually, without the right approach, can actually, cause some problems for businesses. So this is why we're putting this webinar on today, to help support people in obviously making some of those decisions. So diversifying risk just allows you to have alternative revenue streams, when perhaps, you need a buffer because economically our country may be doing not doing as favorably as perhaps the US. That's not true right now necessarily, but in the future it's about kind of scaffolding for making the business a success in the long term. So it can keep a bit of stability around that and just allow you to succeed. Looking at extended product life cycles, really sometimes in the UK, and I found this with the non-alcoholic beverage market to a degree in the early days, there's a degree of saturation in your own market, your life cycles being reached. And so taking your product into the US would certainly enhance that longevity for your product. And it might actually adapt to trends that have been later in coming. I know with the beverage market, we had a very early adoption in the UK and Europe for certain non-alcoholic beverages that were hitting the shelves, and we embraced it a lot sooner. We're certainly very innovative in this country, and it took the US a little while to catch up, and now it's exploding. There are so many products, but early entrants into that market from the UK who are succeeding here, like Caleño Drinks, did really well because they were early to market and they had that competitive edge. Obviously, economies of scale are always going to help in the Y export sort of Q&A. You've got your higher production volumes, so hopefully you're reducing some of your per unit costs. Again, not always the case, but it's certainly something to consider. And one of the interesting things that I've seen being done here by certain brands exporting, they will produce the whole batch and relabel as and when they need for export specifically, so that they keep their pool of product available for any of the markets. So that's just a little sort of tip along the way. And then competitive intelligence. Obviously, you have access to all these different customer behaviors in all these different markets. So, as a whole, that gives you some expertise that perhaps other brands don't have. And obviously, you're integrating that into the learning for your own business. Enhanced brand credibility. That international presence can really add, significant credibility to your brand. And if you're in beverage alcohol or non-alcoholic, if you're certainly in beverages, that actually really helps, certainly with the on-trade and the on-premise, when you're selling to lots of different international markets and international global portfolios of hotels and things like that. So the brand credibility can really help in certain instances. And then this last section here around seasonality, learning, building and taking advantage of your strengths. The seasonality, if you're going to export to Australia, for example, obviously their Christmas is in the summertime for them. So, your brands can have certainly less seasonal variation when it comes to exporting to certain countries. The US, the same. I mean, if you go to the southern parts of the US and Florida, it's never cold there. So, for example, a rum beverage will always succeed because people are always going to be drinking rum. So the seasonal variations differ across the United States as well as across the globe. So there's actually access to a lot more market share in that sense when you take products to the US. Learning and capability. Really exporting, and I've seen this happen, can help you just become much more sophisticated at business. You have to become really nimble with operational strengths and capabilities, being able to pivot quickly to, adapt the way that you're actually labeling, for example, and the demands of a new market can be difficult. And I think the learning process that you go through at the beginning to do that with the right people in your organization certainly allows those business processes to become solidified and more nimble and sophisticated. So I think that really helps. And then taking advantages of our strengths in the Y export, there's still we have this really great heritage kind of key to a lot of our brands and products in the UK which appeal internationally, but specifically in certain parts of the US. So capitalizing on those advantages really can help. And all of this just goes to hopefully, future-proof your business by exporting. So it's definitely building that business case. I think that's quite an easy one to do in many ways. And so I just want to hand over. Catherine, you may have a couple of things here. I'd love to bring you in if you do.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you, Jane. Yeah, I was just going to really touch on what you've explained there. And it's a well-known fact that companies that export not only survive, but tend to thrive much more than companies that don't export. And in actual fact, studies do show that companies are 11% more likely to survive if they go into exporting. So that's not really in relation to US, but that's just to exporting in general. Export does drive innovation and growth, both revenue growth and market expansion. There's also, as Jane touched on, the risk mitigation. So there are new market opportunities, as Jane said, and I have heard that before, that when you're trading with US, you have to look at every state as it's an individual country, because they do have their own idiosyncrasies, etc., and geographical challenges. But also protecting yourself against any sort of domestic market slumps. You know, once you've saturated that domestic market, what do you do? Where do you go? So that's why exporting is always a really a good opportunity when you sort of reach that domestic, when you saturated that domestic market.
Great.
Thank you, Jane.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Okay, we'll go head on to the next slide. There we go. So export readiness, this is really like the final piece before I get into the case study. There are really 5 key areas for export readiness, and you know, you can see them all on here, but the first one being financial considerations. So I talked up front about the idea of obviously having that up to 18-month investment runway and such like, and the working capital, because the fixed cost for investment in the compliance alone can run to a few thousand. Now, for some businesses, that may not be a huge chunk of cash, but for other businesses and small businesses such as Caleño, when I was working with them, it definitely, you know, it wasn't an insignificant fixed cost. So making sure everything obviously is ready legally for that international jump is right. So the financial fixed costs up front really are important to look at. And those are quite easy to sort of study. It's not like a difficult, complex process. And also considering, you know, at the moment, there's some nuances around obviously tariff considerations. I've had new businesses come and ask me specifically, well, what does that mean? You know, will it still be in place? Well, I don't have a crystal ball and I don't know, but what I do know is if we can prepare for any of those eventualities and actually include it as a variable cost or as a line item, even as a KPI for the future, you know, because we're not quite sure where that's going to go, then it's just really good practice to get into and to make sure that those considerations have already been accommodated, and certainly it's accommodated for in the pricing strategy. So I'd say looking at those pieces, what's your pricing look like? Can you afford to do it? And what does your current state of play look like in your home market? Is certainly really key to understanding your export readiness as a business. I know, Catherine, you've got points to jump in. Do you want me to wait till the end and you jump in and cover your?
I can cover mine at the end, yeah.
Okay, great. So I'll move on to the operational capacity, well, operational capability. So looking at your existing, you know, contract manufacturers, or you may even be manufacturing yourselves, how much do you need to scale? And is this going to tip you into a point where you need to expand or invest in more capital equipment and things like that? That's certainly, I would do a 1 year, a 3 year and a 5 year plan and just make sure that actually your growth plans all fit into what that's going to look like from an investment perspective. You know, one of the things that I've seen happen very quickly with export is, you know, a brand export their kind of 2 main SKUs, and then suddenly they see an opportunity for something slightly different. So, for example, you know, you're shipping a bottle of a drink and then you're making a ready to drink. 2 very different production lines, very different ways of handling things, but you never quite know what opportunities are going to come your way once you land your product in that market. So you don't have a crystal ball, you can't see what new opportunities may come your way, but you can have a look at the potential. So just understanding what your internal capabilities are, and if you're going to need to expand to other premises, or even consider ultimately within the first 1 to 3 years going into market and actually contract manufacturing in that market. That's a very different proposition that takes out the export piece as well. But it's certainly having visibility of that thought process is really key. And I'm going to go back to shelf life requirements, but very specific to food and beverage. You know, products can be sat on the sea for quite some time. So operationally, like, we bring logistics into this piece because, you know, cold storage, how long it's going to be on the sea, Things like non-alcoholic beverages freeze over the winter because there's no alcohol in them to keep them liquid. So that was something I learned very early on. You need to find specialty wrapping for your containers and things like that. So just having a heads up logistically around what you can do to mitigate any of those potential problems. The worst thing that can happen is your first export freezes on the water or arrives in some awful condition that you weren't anticipating. So that's really around shipping and packaging. And then resources. Do you have the talent within your operations team to scaffold an international move? I think from my experience, the biggest and best help has been having operational support, and it doesn't have to be senior operations people at all. It just has to be very, very switched on, quick thinkers, problem solvers, people that know how to react to situations. Because early on, it can be a lot of juggling when you're doing those first exports. So you do everything in the world to mitigate the paperwork issues and everything else. And I think Catherine can talk about that. But ultimately, you need some quick thinking people in your team. And they can be people that just, you don't need new hires for that necessarily, but it's just understanding what you've got resource-wise internally. And also on the operational piece as well, the ability to negotiate contracts that are going to be favourable to your cash flow. That may be easier said than done when you're a new brand, but certainly I've had more conversations with people recently around the tariff questions. Can you lock in an importer that's going to support or share the cost of any future tariff consideration? Those are some of the things that you could be thinking about. Now, 12 months ago, we wouldn't have even been factoring that into this program. I mean, I wouldn't have been thinking about it because it just wasn't really on my radar for the US. But certainly these conversations help. They help everyone just feel like they know where they stand. I've had conversations with importers who actually have really struggled with having to pay tariffs on products that were on the water 3 months before the tariffs were even kind of introduced. So all of this helps mitigate some of that uncertainty. So I think operationally having it's just a little checklist. I mean, it's just knowing, can you contain those larger challenges before they even happen. Then we're into management and resources. So I think having dedicated resources is obviously important, but I'm not suggesting in any way you go and recreate your entire business for export. Obviously a lot of these initial things can be shared across the current disciplines that you have. But what I would say is with regards management is there's total key buy-in and understanding of actually what comes next, because it's really important to have that identity that this is part of a broader strategy for the business, and that can be kind of filtered down through all the employees and everyone's expectations. Nobody likes to get any nasty surprises about what their current job is. So it's just having that buy-in at the most senior levels and making sure that it's integrated as a goal across the business, and understanding, are you ready for that? If that isn't the case, then, or if it's a bit like, oh, let's just chuck it at the wall and see, that can be conducted in a very local, small way as a test. You can do a separate test and learn for the US, but I certainly wouldn't suggest that as a strategy for a growth strategy. That's a separate sort of conversation. And then third-party expertise, again, resourcing is really important, but you don't need separate resources. However, you may need third-party expertise to come in and give you some help on specific issues. Certainly, you'd need to do that with legal and compliance, unless you have a big resource that an international team of lawyers, for example, or within your organisation. But I would recommend bringing in the relevant people very early on, before you're, 6 months at least before you decide you want to export a product for any of those pieces. So management and resources, obviously super important, but again, not complex, just a checklist of sort of where you need to get to. And then product and market. So sort of looked at this already, but what are you selling and where's it going to resonate and who's going to want to buy it? It's just a bit of that upfront research. Are the flavours a good fit? There's some sanity checks around, how will Marmite be received in Florida? How would, some of those things that are really, really unique to Great Britain maybe aren't aren't going to land that well in the US. It's quite interesting to look at that, and vice versa. So I think looking at your actual product, the size, the size, and also how it comes. Is it normal for that particular product to be sold in a certain way? Is it recycled? All of those things, and that really will come from market research and understanding. Even a trade mission, I would always say go to your market and walk around all the stores before you do anything. That would be my very first suggestion. And then legal and compliance. I mean, I've touched on this already, but there's trademarks and things like that. I know, Catherine, you're going to touch on that. I had one particular brand who had a logo very similar to one of the major retailers in the US. And I said, you need to trademark it now, because, if you get there and you start selling this, you could end up having to change the complete look, because it was so similar. And so that's really important. A lot of young brands, especially emerging brands, don't necessarily think to do that because they think they're set internationally and globally with the current trademark that they have. But that's important. And then compliance. Compliance. I kind of I live and breathe this. It's the first step to making sure that your product won't be seized at customs. I've seen it happen. It's not pretty at all. And it's such a simple step and straightforward, and the people that know what they're doing can support you with this are here. I work with partners who actually have been doing this for 20 years. So they have FDA specialists that can run through that for any. And I should say here, I haven't mentioned this, but if you're an alcohol brand, it's obviously a different set of regulations. There's 2 pathways here. Any food and drink and non-alcoholic beverage goes through the Food and Drug Administration pathway. Nothing is approved from a label standpoint. It has to just satisfy the regulations. For alcohol, everything goes through the TBB, the Alcohol Tobacco Bureau, and your labels do get approved. So there's just 2 very distinct ways of getting your product compliant. So it has to fit one of those 2 pathways, depending on what you're actually exporting. So legal and compliance, just super important and quite dry, but it's the first thing we really need to look at. And I think that's it from me as far as export readiness goes. I'll hand over to you, Catherine.
Okay, thanks, Jane. Yeah, so again, just sort of going through the list really. In terms of financial considerations, I think you've touched there, Jane, on having cash flow and all those kind of things in place to be export ready. But you also want to consider how you're going to get paid as well. That's a very, very big question, and you need to think about this up front. There are various different ways of getting paid internationally, and you may have heard of what's called the risk ladder, which is all about trade payment risk, because obviously it's very different when you're dealing with somebody over in the States. You can't just hop on a plane and go over and see them if they're not paying you for whatever reason. It's far more difficult to do that than if you're dealing with somebody who's maybe based in the UK. So looking at the sort of the risk in terms of payment, there's various different payment terms such as open account. So that can be quite high risk for non-payment to an exporter, to you as an exporter, because you sent those goods without payment. So if you're shipping on open account, you would normally do that with somebody you've got a trading relationship with. But it's also low risk for non-delivery to the overseas importer, because you've sent the product and they haven't actually paid for it. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got cash in advance. So of course, this is very low risk to you as an exporter because you've received your funds already, you've received payment already, but it can be quite high risk for non-delivery to the importer overseas, as you've paid for those goods up front with no guarantee of delivery. A couple of other sort of payment options in international trade you may have heard of: cash against documents or documentary collections. So this is much less risky for both parties because, and I won't go into them in great detail, and I'll happily speak to anybody after the webinar about them, but much less risky for both parties, as all the documents, all the shipping documents and any payments are handled by both the seller and the buyer's respective banks. So it's a much less risky way of doing business. And also letters of credit. Now, a letter of credit is a guaranteed form of payment that protects both the buyer and the seller. assuming that all of the terms and conditions within that letter of credit have been met correctly. So as I say, I'm not going to go into how they all work right now because we'll be here forever. But if anybody wants to chat to me about that afterwards, then please feel free. In terms of the other items listed there, operational management resources, I think you do have to have the right people, you have to have the right staff, and you have to have people that have some knowledge of international trade, or you have to know where to find that knowledge in terms of logistical considerations. I will touch on Incoterms, but I'll do that at the end of the webinar, because Incoterms do have an impact on sort of what you're paying for and your responsibility. So we'll touch on that a little bit later. You also want to consider who within your company is going to be driving this forward, because you do need somebody who's going to make sure they're on top of everything and they are driving that export business forward. In terms of legal and compliance, so you have to consider things such as importing country regulations. And obviously Jane's touched on the FDA and the different channels you need to go down for depending on the type of product you've got. But often it can depend on, you need to consider the documentation that's going to be required, the shipping documentation, the customs clearance paperwork that you're going to need. Are there restrictions on your goods? Again, touching on compliance, do you need any export licenses for your goods? So you'll need to speak to export licensing about that sort of thing. Customs compliance is absolutely key. Customs are so on it, particularly in America at the moment. The CBP are literally checking, the size of the shoes of the people that are bringing the goods into the US. So you need to make sure you've got, your correct commodity codes, correct customs procedure codes, correct licensing in place. And I can tell you that customs take a very, very dim view if you put misleading information or false information, which I'm sure none of you would do knowingly, but it does happen. So they do take a dim view of it, and it can cause you to have quite high financial penalties if you're not compliant and you're not complying with those laws and rules and regulations. Or the other thing I was just going to mention is also we touched on IP, and I don't have a huge amount to say on intellectual property, but it's something that you do need to consider, and it is there to protect yourself. Jane, you mentioned about logos, etc. There was a case, I think it was about 3 or 4 years ago, where somebody was using, let's say, 2 yellow arches that looked quite similar to a well-known burger seller, and so they were taken to court actually, and they were not allowed to use the logo that they had produced. It was very similar. It wasn't the same, but it was just very similar. But that was a whole, I'm sure that was a whole headache for them that they didn't really need to have to go through. Thank you. Jane, if you'd like to move on to your case study.
Yeah, definitely. I'll crack on with that one.
Thank you.
Great, that was lovely, Catherine. Actually, in driving it forward, I just wanted to quickly say one of the most successful things around Caleño was having a commercial director who was fully invested in growing internationally, and it was so important that I had his ear and he trusted me. There was a really good relationship there, but it was very, very important to making that successful, because without him understanding the information I was bringing back to him about growth and margins and everything else, it just wouldn't have been possible. So to get started quickly, I'll take you through this. This really covers the things we've been through, the why, the who, and then really the readiness. So Caleño Drinks really did make a success, and I'll take you through a bit of background, what the challenge was for getting there, selecting the US as a market, how we built the strategy, and again, how we actually got the product there and executed on that strategy, and regulatory compliance, which as always comes first usually. So I'll talk you through this. So Caleño, you may or may not have heard of them, but they are a Bristol-based business. It was founded by Ellie Webb in 2017, and it's really a tropical non-alcoholic spirits brand. She was targeting the growing non-alc movement and beverage market in this country, and she was uniquely positioned with this tropical forward zero proof rum product. There are other products out there, but her tropical forward products really resonated in the US when she did her initial market research. So when I look at the initial challenge around how this was going to land in the US, the challenge for her here was that the UK market was pretty saturated. There were only so many spaces on shelves in Waitrose and all these other grocery stores that actually were taking in products. She had distribution in a couple of the large supermarkets, and then obviously, interestingly, some of the bigger brands started to launch their own products as well. So Ellie very early on started to look overseas for international opportunities to grow the brand, and especially with this unique proposition that she had. She wasn't just going in as like an alcohol adjacent kind of replacement. So the tropical bit was really key here. So when I talked about flavors earlier, it was really important that she had that differentiation. She needed to grow, diversify her market, but one of the challenges up front was really the complex import regulations for beverage products around. It was a new market, it was nascent. Understanding the compliance piece, actually, even the compliance people didn't necessarily understand what this looked like and where it fit in, because it was no longer alcohol. It fitted into under the FDA's jurisdiction. And the final challenge for her and for us was looking at an unfamiliar retail landscape. That's why she brought me along, because having lived in Chicago for 7 years with my own brand, I'd had that experience of growing a brand in America across all different channels, D2C, in grocery, and actually in food service as well. So I had that expertise to bring at this point where she was ready to kind of launch. So looking at how market selection, she really chose the US because it was ideal based on her research for the tropical non-alcoholic spirits, effectively. And when I talked about the 50 states and the 50 countries, we really honed in on some key target states. So Florida being one of them initially, New York, because getting into the on-premise and that part of the trade was a really good proposition for us. Our importer was based in New York, so that made it a lot easier as well. So just having a couple of key markets was really enough at that early stage. We had funding, but the growth was going to depend on future raises. So also depending on your finance raise cycle, this is quite important to understand as well as to how big you go, how early on. So we looked at the US. She'd already looked at the US, brought me in when she'd already sort of made that decision. And then we had all these different market entry options, direct export, distributors, but we actually used an importer specific to non-alcoholic on the East Coast. So it made the shipping easy. We just went from the UK to the East Coast of America, and they took that on ex-works pricing. So initially, and I know Catherine will touch on this. So, with this particular product, obviously there are cultural considerations as to where it's going to land and consumer preferences. So that really honed us in on those specific markets, such as Florida. And then looking at, a strategic partnership with our importer was really key to us having the support for a non-alcoholic product, because had we gone through an alcohol beverage importer, it just wouldn't have got the love that we needed. So then we looked at the distribution strategy, and we worked with that non-alcoholic importer. They sold us on their own D2C website, so we didn't need our own. We had no direct-to-consumer costs or expenses, which can be very expensive when you're starting out in the US. Shipping across the US is very expensive, so we left that to our specialized importer. And so we really had this really nice entry point to introduce a new brand and then spend the money on building market awareness around it. So two things we did with that after launching on Amazon as well, so it was available on Amazon, was really working out how best to promote the product. So we did some really key early cocktail classes in a really nice on-premise chain of restaurants that was tropical forward, and we were then able to sell into retail from that very early on-premise kind of success. It allowed us to get the sampling we needed and bring it to all these potential consumers across Florida and the New York market. But just looking at some more of the strategy and execution pieces, I'm aware that we're kind of coming down on time a little bit, so I'll try and just go through these a bit quicker, and I'm happy to answer any other questions people may have specifically about this case study. But, you know, looking at our strategic execution was around having that me as a market consultant, because I'd already lived there and had connections that we required. And then the comprehensive market entry roadmap really looked at making sure we did our numbers. So with my commercial director, who actually came out of Diageo originally, the numbers were so important. We planned volume, we knew what our A&P budgets were and our forecast for the entire year across an editorial calendar that resonated in the US. So all of their key moments, like the 4th of July, Dry July, Sober October, Thanksgiving, all of those key points were really integrated into our strategic growth plan. And then looking at compliance, we didn't need any TTB regulations around alcohol because it was non-alcoholic, but we went through the whole compliance process with this partner that I still use today because they're absolutely exceptional in everything that they deliver. And then the other execution piece was building relationships in the retail. So we utilised our industry connections to make sure that we actually had a really solid foundation in one of the biggest, well, the biggest alcohol and soft drink retailer in the US, Total Wine & More. So we built that relationship with one big retailer. There's lots of different strategies. You can go very small through obviously all the independents, but we actually very early on were welcomed by this large retailer and were able to use that as a really good jumping off point. And then onto the final piece of the regulatory compliance. Obviously, we had all the export requirements we needed, having succeeded in having compliant labels and following what we call a foreign supplier verification program. That's entirely separate, but it's a necessity for anybody taking products into the US. So that's something I'm happy to talk about offline as well. And we met all the standards for the destination country. I mean, that's key, obviously. Compliance first approach, getting it all ready before you put it on a ship was super important. And like I said, it's not necessarily the most interesting part of it, but it's super, super important to get it right, making sure that all your labeling and your packaging is done and that any pitfalls are avoided. You know, to Catherine's point, you don't want to get there and find that your logo is very similar to someone else's. So really smooth market entry for Caleño. And so I'll just quickly go over some of the results and the sort of success metrics that we use. So we had major retail success. So we secured that nationwide spot in 250 Total Wine & More stores with 2 SKUs. And very quickly off the back of that, we then diversified into a US version of our canned cocktails, mocktails. And that's where we had these 2 very different products. As I mentioned earlier, having capabilities that exist currently operationally within our contract manufacturers was really important because they could then go and produce what we needed for this additional market. And some of these retailers take 12, 18 months, 2 years to list in. Some want you overnight. So we had to be really, really quick on the uptake of that. And we had the product in their stores with manufactured to a new spec within 3 months. So having already done the hard work up front with the initial 2 products, we could then use that foundation to launch new products very successfully. We'd already had market validation because we'd had flagship retail placement in this premium beverage category for non-alcoholic beverages. And then we were able to establish a strong US presence in the on-trade as well in certain key markets like New York, where we had someone in market actually driving that sales effort to make sure that the product was sips on lips, as we called it. And that's key with any product. And we were successfully positioned as a competitive brand in the non-alcoholic beverage market in the US. We did some very early work making sure we were present in all of the smaller non-alcoholic specialty retailers, which really got us quite a lot of press in those early days. We were lucky, we were early to market, and so that really helped. Success factors and best practices. I would say, utilizing specialized expertise for specific projects and partnerships is really key. You don't need to recruit, an entire new faculty of resources to make it happen. Just pick and choose the right people at the right time for what you need. Everything was built on relationships, genuine partnerships with retailers. That takes a long time in the US. That's the one thing I would say. It takes a long time here too, but just factoring that into your growth plans is really important. It's not easy. It's a massive country. There are lots of opportunities, but it's really staying focused on what your opportunity for your product is. And then just being patient, building a proper foundation before you scale and before it runs away with you. And really, the value up front of investing in proper market entry was key. It's not by accident. Generally speaking, I think those kind of case studies come along 1 in a million, where it happens by accident, that suddenly you find yourself in the US and you've exceeded all your expectations. You need cash, and you need some strategic influence as well to be able to make it work. So what are the key takeaways? All of the above. I've said it all before. The expert guidance, relationships, category specific knowledge is something I haven't touched on specifically, but really going out there and understanding your category, I would say, is the best way you can spend £1,000, maybe £2,000 up front. Take a flight, get yourself in market, have a good look, take advantage of the trade missions that perhaps the government have on offer, and go out there and make sure you know what you're looking at. I remember just coming back to the UK after having lived in the US for 7 years and being absolutely astonished at the tiny little portion of shelf space that we give over to kind of snack bars in this country and to drinks, to soft drinks, because it's just absolutely vast. When you walk into some of these grocery stores in the US, the choice on offer is unbelievable. And so I think it really shifts your mind as to where you want to position yourself. So understanding that category specific knowledge, super important up front. And I think I probably need to hand over to Catherine, because I'm concerned we're going to run out of time otherwise. So I hope I got everything in there. I'm going to hand over to you if that's all right.
No, that's fine. I was just going to touch on sort of other considerations, really, Jen. I don't know if you've got anything else to say in terms of your case study, but I think just a couple of sort of really important things we need to touch on is firstly Incoterms. So Incoterms, for those of you that don't know, are 11 internationally recognised trade terms that define who is responsible for the different parts of that export process. So who's responsible for paying for this? So who's going to pay for the export clearance? Who's going to pay for the freight? Who's going to pay for the insurance, import clearance duties, etc., as well as determining where the risk passes, where the goods are en route. You do need to be careful. Many UK traders ship on an ex-works basis, and really ex-works should only be used as a domestic term. And the reason for that is that with ex-works, your responsibility as an exporter is to make goods available to your overseas clients. So once you've emailed them and told them that the goods are ready for shipment, if the goods are stuck in, are held in your warehouse, you've told them the goods are ready for collection, available for collection. If you have a fire in that warehouse overnight, you're not responsible for that, because you've told them the goods are ready for collection, and that's now their responsibility. So using the correct Incoterm can have massive implications on your responsibility and the risk. Also in terms of payments as well, because each Incoterm defines exactly what you are paying for. The other thing with ex-works is that you do need to have proof that you've exported goods out of the United Kingdom on an ex-works basis. And the problem with ex-works is that legally your overseas importer is paying for the freight and everything else in relation to the shipment, so they legally do not have to give you proof that those goods have left the United Kingdom. The problem with this is that if you are inspected by the VAT office and you cannot prove to them that the goods have been exported and therefore VAT should not have been charged, you would be liable for that VAT bill. And again, I've seen that happen where companies have been caught by the VAT implications, and have actually had to close down because they've had such a huge VAT bill. Just on the other side of that, and I'll be as brief as I can, similarly, if you decide to sell on a DDP basis, a delivered duty paid basis, which is completely the opposite to the Ex Works, where you are liable for all of the payments, including the duties and taxes in the US, this can have implications, because you do need to have a fiscal representation in America who will be able to process the import declaration and also pay those duties and taxes and any charges into the US. And of course, we've already touched on the issues surrounding the fluctuating duty rates. The other thing I very, very quickly did want to mention is about the de minimis charges on the tariffs. So that's very, very topical at the moment. Many of you will be aware that any goods valued at $800 prior to the 29th of August, there was a sort of a tariff suspension. Effectively, you could import goods of $800 into the US with no tariffs being charged. That is changed. And I think from the 1st of October, it was quite worrying. Last week, they came out with potential new tariffs on pharmaceutical products, which probably come under this sector somewhat. So as an example of that, the US was stating that they would potentially charge 100% import duties on certain branded products, pharmaceutical products, unless the manufacturer was actually building a plant in the US. So that obviously does have huge implications. Just a very brief example of that. So I actually looked at ibuprofen. And there's the normal rate for ibuprofen is 6.5%, but we now have this reciprocal duty rate that the US are charging of additional 10%. So your actual duty payable is going to be 16.5%. We're quite lucky at the moment in the UK. We do have quite low reciprocal duty rates compared to a lot of other countries, but it is something you do need to be careful of and you do need to factor in. And that's it from me. I will be quiet now. Thank you, Jane.
Well, I will probably hand it over to Fiona to just look see if there's any questions, because obviously we've got the what's next. There's lots of government support. Catherine and I are happy to answer any questions, via email. If you've got specific thoughts about readiness assessments, there's online support for all of that. You can do an import plan on the DVT website. There's so many resources that I'm happy to send out to everybody. And Fiona, I'll hand it over to you. Just thank you so much for your ear today, everybody. It's been lovely.
And I've also put, thank you, Jane, thank you, and thank you, Kath. I've put in the chat, if you did want any help specifically from Jane and Kath, to either email our internationaltrade@businesswest.co.uk email address. And I've also put a website link in there, which we've got a form, so you can fill in that as well. And Jane's information is on that for that page as well. So you can kind of get in contact with us through that. So in terms of questions, we've actually only got one question at the moment. It's from Tina from Humanity. So thank you, Tina. It's actually about online marketplaces. So
Yeah.
I think probably, Jane, this is for you. Have you read the question? So it's basically...
I haven't. Do you want to read it out for me? And then
I will.
Yeah, thank you.
So it's I was wondering, for online marketplaces like Walmart, when you don't have an importer, how does it work with getting an agent and shipping, since there is no importer, as the company would just ship to Walmart warehouse, which would then go on to sell to the end consumer?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you so much. So going back to compliance, I actually, you can have an agent, you can use a global import agent who will do exactly that for you. So you pay them an annual fee It's fairly nominal, to be honest, for their services, and they will act as your foreign supplier verification partner. They will be your import partner, and effectively they are just on the paperwork, the commercial invoice at import. So if there's any problems, they have a facility in the US and they have a facility in the UK, so they're registered in both countries to actually be an agent on your behalf. So they don't act as your importer of record as such, but I'd be happy to talk to you like more specifically around that. But there are facilities to import to walmart.com, and you'll be able to do that. And it works the same with Amazon as well, because everything is literally going to their warehouse and nobody is owning that product. So as you said, Tina, Walmart don't own it, they're not importing it, you're doing it all at your own risk. So you'll just find an agent, and I can help you with that. Any questions with that? Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully that answers the question.
There's a little thumb, so hopefully it does.
Okay. Yeah.
So unless there's any other questions, I think we'll probably wrap up. Oh, here we go, Alistair. Thank you, Alistair. Are there any/many benefits of dealing with a company which is based in both Canada and the USA?
If this is a question around import, then it's a very good question. You will need different routes to market for those countries. So yes, there is a benefit to working with importing into the US and then importing into Canada. They have very different methods of import. There's different ways of doing it. And certainly looking at the tariff considerations between the US and Canada would obviously change. We'd have to look at it strategically, but the flow of goods between the two countries, the question around that and the right answer would depend on what you're importing and what your strategic vision is and why you want to go into both countries. So yeah, I think I understood that correctly. Potentially you would want an importer in each country, and it depends on the product as well. Really depends on the product.
Yeah, if I can just jump in as well, there is actually a trade agreement between Canada, US, and Mexico. So if you were importing into one country, such as US, and then you wanted to then export goods from that country into Canada, then there would probably be preferential duty rates and tariff benefits for you to take as well. But again, as Jane says, we'd probably need to know a bit more about the products and what you're shipping and what route they're taking and that sort of thing.
Great questions, though.
Thank you for that, Alistair. Any other final questions? Okay, well, we are always here at the end of a form, at the end of a phone, at the end of an email. So it's been really lovely to have everybody here. So I think we'll wrap up now. So thank you very much, Jane, and thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you very much for everybody who came along.